Hello, I'd just like to welcome everyone to this meeting, which has been hosted by myself, Alex Sobel MP, with the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. Today's meeting really is about how we in the labour and trade union movement can work more closely with our colleagues and comrades in the Ukrainian trade union movement and see how we can support them both politically in Parliament and practically with practical support. I'm really pleased, and we're at the point now. Actually, I just want to say we're at the point now in the war that has been, which is being conducted by Putin in the most horrific way with horrible war crimes, and we need to see him and his commanders in the Hague in the criminal court. But it's now at a point where we can start to talk about reconstruction of Ukraine, of international support, and of other issues related to that, particularly the debt that Ukraine owes the international community, and some of the other issues such as labour standards and social inequality, as well as just what's happening on the ground in terms of conflict. And finally, I just want to say, that we're all in awe of everybody in Ukraine and the entire effort of the Ukrainian people, whether that's fighting on the front line, whether that's emergency services, whether that's people just keeping the country going, and even people who have left Ukraine and left their families and friends behind to find sanctuary elsewhere. We stand with you in the UK labour and trade union movement completely and totally. So we've got a really excellent lineup of speakers today. We're streaming this and we're gonna share it later. But in terms of the speakers today, we have and this is the order I think people are going to speak in. Mykhailo, Volynets, who's the chair of the Confederation of Free Trade Unions of Ukraine. Vasily, Andreev, who's the vice chair of the Federation of Trade Unions of Ukraine. Then we're going to have Anthony, who's a member here in the Welsh Assembly of Ukrainian descent, probably the most of the parliamentarian in the UK is most closely descended from Ukraine. My grandparents came from Lviv, but it's a generation removed, but mix more close than me. Then we have Yulia Yurchenko, who's from Ukraine but works now here in the UK, Bohdan Ferenc, and then finally Gregory Schwartz from the University of Bristol. And I think Greg is also going to help us with some interpreting where and when we need it. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mykhailo. Mykhailo, the floor is yours.
Добрий день. Я вам вдячний за таку конференцію, таку нашу зустріч. Сьогодні до України також прибув Кемаль Оскан, віце-президент глобальної профспілки «Індустріал». Але я пам'ятаю 23 лютого цього року, коли делегація від британських депутатів і профспілковців британських відвідала Україну, коли всі посольства вже покинули на територію нашої держави. Ваша делегація знаходилась цей час в Києві. Це надзвичайно був мужній поступок. А вже вранці, через декілька годин, російський агресор здійснював бомбардування українських міст і сіл.
So, I'm going to я буду перекладати. At the moment, the leader of the International Trade Union Federation is visiting Ukraine, so it's a very opportune moment. The last time that Mykhailo had an opportunity to speak was just the day before the bombardment started.
Ви сказали зараз те, що я мав сказати. Бо ми багато зараз думаємо над тим, як розробити спільні проекти разом з нашими партнерами із Європи, із Сполучених Штатів Америки, Австралії, Канади, Японії.
So, Alex, you have just essentially said the very things that Mykhailo says he would like to have said, which is that he'd like to work, or we, in their case, would like to work with their partners in Europe, North America, Australia, about rebuilding things.
Ми передбачаємо, що ці проекти мають бути направлені на відбудову економіки України, не чекаючи завершення війни, а також відбудови соціальної сфери і культурних і інших складових.
We think that it's important to start the reconstruction reconstruction even before the completion of the war, and we need to focus on both the economic but also the social and cultural spheres as well.
Уряди названих мною країн дуже багато роблять на підтримку України. Не тільки допомагаючи фінансово і гуманітарно, а надаючи зброю, яка нам потрібна, і це спасає життя наших людей. І так само зберігає нашу країну від її знищення.
So the governments that he had mentioned, which are Japan, European countries, North America, and Australia, are doing a lot to help Ukraine, and they are ranging from sending military, which is really important in order to defend the country and not to allow its disintegration, and financial help.
Але не все може самостійно зробити влада цих країн. Є громадський сектор, профспілки і є взаємодія з парламентами.
But not only the governments of these countries, or it's not sufficient for the governments of these countries to be able to help. What's important is also, or that there is, the civil society and other parts of society that can help out in this regard.
Великобританія, в нас склалася тверда думка, що Великобританія найнадійніший наш партнер України.
We have it's become a very firm impression in our mind that the UK has become a very reliable partner of Ukraine in this difficult moment.
І ми усвідомлюємо, що опоненти України так само здійснюють тиск і на вас у різних формах.
And we are aware that Ukraine's opponents are currently putting pressure on our partners in order to forestall their help for Ukraine.
Тут також нам треба попрацювати, як протидіяти такому тиску, інформаційним атакам, брехні, фейкам.
We need to think about ways of counteracting such efforts in the sphere of information, to fight fakes and disinformation.
Я вчора повернувся з Польщі і з Німеччини, де зустрічався з українськими біженцями, і ми розуміємо, що це ваша допомога і ваші кошти теж туди вкладаються на допомогу країнам, які прийняли наших біженців, а так само і ваша країна, яка продовжує приймати наших біженців.
I just returned from Poland and Germany, where I met with the refugees who are there, and we understand that the kind of help that they're receiving is, of course, everybody's input, including this country, of course, the UK, which is also helping out with the refugees, and we understand that this is all.
В країнах Западу українці відчувають себе захищеними, не сипляться на голови бомби, їхні діти навчаються в школі.
The Ukrainians feel themselves welcomed, they feel themselves safe. Whilst they're in these countries, children are going to school, people are being integrated in society.
Але без такої допомоги, без відкриття вами кордонів, ми не могли б справитись з цим внутрішнім переміщенням, великим внутрішнім переміщенням всередині країни.
Without the borders having been opened to Ukrainians, it would have been much more difficult to guarantee the safety of Ukrainians. Even the internal displacement would have been more difficult.
Я знаю, що в мене обмежений час. Я хочу торкнутися останнього блоку питань.
I'd just like to add a few more points because I don't have very much time.
Це законодавчі ініціативи, бо ми профспілки працювали з органами влади, роботодавцями, нашими соціальними партнерами, і раптом окремі депутати намагаються зараз. Є зв'язок?
Так.
Так. І раптом окремі депутати намагаються суттєво змінити трудове законодавство.
So I'd like to focus on the kind of things that we do in the area of legislation, and we thought things were, we've been working on that, but now during the war, there are some parliamentarians who are trying to change the agenda and put through some legislation that was not foreseen.
Я бачу, що тут зараз аудиторія та, яка орієнтується, як формується українське законодавство.
As I can see, the audience is the kind of audience who understands or has an understanding of the legislative efforts in Ukraine.
І Україна, як яка вийшла із Радянського Союзу, поступово будує свої демократичні процеси.
And Ukraine, as a country that had essentially emerged from the Soviet Union, is still building these democratic processes.
І тут також потрібна і на подальшому ваша допомога, увага, щоб ми, інтегруючись в європейський простір, законодавчо не порушували директиви Європейського Союзу, міжнародні норми і стандарти, зокрема Конвенції Міжнародної організації праці.
And in this regard, in this area, we also need your help. As we try to integrate into the European Union, we need to make sure that the legal basis of the kind of legislation that we are trying to achieve correspond to both international and European standards.
Ще раз дякую вам за увагу до України, до українців, до всіх наших проблем, і ми відчуваємо разом з вами себе у спільному строї від побудови демократичного світу.
We'd like to thank everybody for your efforts and for the support that you're expressing towards Ukraine in this difficult moment, and you're helping us build a future democratic, prosperous Ukraine.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just realised while we're doing this that the sound's coming out of my laptop rather than out of the television. Can people who are here hear it okay? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Right. Because I was trying to fiddle with it, but that's probably going to take up more time than is needed. So anyway, without any further ado, I'd like to invite Vasily to speak. So the floor is yours, Vasily.
Yes, thank you very much. Михайло Якович, я з повагою до вас, але я з вашого дозволу також по-англійськи буду, для того, щоб скоротити трошки час на переклад. Я вам, якщо вам перекладаю, це буде дуже супер. Радий, I'm very glad to see all of you. And let me also follow my colleague Mykhailo Volynets with the words of gratitude to Great Britain and maybe most of the nations in the world, and especially for Europe, not only European Union, who have accommodated millions of our citizens, and most of those millions were, of course, women and children, together with old people, and this is very valuable for our nation. We didn't expect, at least not me, I didn't expect such kind of solidarity support from all the nations at the border of Ukraine and further. Then what I need to say that we expect the half of our economy will disappear this year, and the prediction is 45% of GDP falling, and we see like the entire industrial cities are destroyed with the missiles and the shelling, like Mariupol, and those were the centers where $1 billion of international trade were created in Ukraine. The same as state finances are right now under the very, very severe pressure. And we see that with the 30% of falling of the national currency only the last week, which also creates the inflation flow and creates of the increasing of the poverty. Along with that, of course, these 3 months which already passed from the beginning of the war created a suppression to people's savings, and all people have right now coming to them. Nevertheless, people are coming back to Ukraine. We see more than 2 weeks already the numbers in the border control. More Ukrainians are coming inside of Ukraine than fleeing outside of our country, and this creates extra pressure, of course, to labor market, which is also about 30-50% of the working places are still not opened, and if opened, are not paid. Yes, such kind of employment in Ukraine with no salary still existing, not only in small businesses, but in big industrial sectors like energy, like metallurgy. It exists, so people are working 40 hours per week and not receiving salary more than two months already. And along with that crisis of the labor market, we see already deterioration of the legal regulation. Started in the end of March during the wartime, during the martial law. We were deprived of many rights, like for collective agreements, for salary, as I said, for the length of the working hours, and for the health and safety, and so on. To some extent, our members agreed with that, so they need to make they believe that they need to make their input to the national struggle and to the victory against Russia. But as we see, our government enjoyed that and started to suppress labor rights more. That old story with the legal draft 5371 from the late 2020 appeared once again at the national agenda of the parliament, and even worse, we expect that the very old story 3 years ago, the legal draft 2708 could come back with the regulation of the most significant depriving of the trade unions from their rights. More than concerning to the reconstruction of the country, we see official figures that for more than 7 million families are right now facing with the damage to their houses or flats. More than 1 million of those have lost everything they have with their housing, and of course that will take such big an amount of the investment that we will need at least 10 years for the construction. Along with that, the big trouble we see right now, the discussion about so-called mobilization of the labor market to reconstruct the country started to appear in the national discussion. And we don't know to the last extent what does it mean mobilization for the reconstruction. Does it mean work with no payment, work with no working hours, or what else? And for us, for our affiliate from the construction workers, it's also a big question, because right now more than 90% of the construction market is still, and even those your employers didn't disappear during the wartime, they come back and calling the construction workers to work with no salaries at least first months until they will earn some money to pay back people who are still with no salaries from January and February 2022. So those big issues are pushing us for the considering. Does the discussion in the European Union and the external funding going through the idea about only money for the reconstruction, but no rights, and the discussion about the rights for the workers who are going to rebuild this country? And this is a very big issue because it doesn't reflect. It is not reflected in any speeches of the international leaders who are right now promising big investment in the Ukrainian economy. shortly, everything I wanted to say on behalf of FPU. Thank you very much for your support, and also we remember, like, you were only one day before war started in our country, and from all of our heart, we understand how brave you are to be in such kind of time in February in our country.
Thank you. Thank you, Vasily. I think those are really important points that we can take here in Parliament in terms of labour rights when it comes to reconstruction and funding and finance. Unfortunately, our government obviously isn't a government where the trade union movement is allied to the governing party. We're in the opposition. We can raise those questions, but in the EU and now in Australia, there are governments who are affiliated to the trade union movement who are in government. So we can work with those as opposition with those that are in government, I think, which will make us much stronger. I know that Mick Anthony has got another meeting, so I'm going to take him next. And just because, unfortunately, if I turned you around to see the audience, then I'd lose the TV. So I can't do that. But just to let Mick know and the rest of you know that we've been joined by Christina Reese, who's a former Shadow Secretary of State for Wales, who's waving. So but you can't see that. So we have, some senior parliamentarians here as well as people from the trade union movement and from People's Offices. But over to you, Mick.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm here speaking as a member of the Welsh Parliament. I am also a member of the Welsh Government and Counsel General, as well as Minister for the Constitution. The comments I want to make are, as much as anything, directed to the international community and the debate that is just starting. And I know that President Zelensky has started raising this issue, as has other members of the Ukrainian parliamentarians. First one is the evidence of war crimes in Ukraine is overwhelming, and there are now large numbers of international lawyers who are engaged in supporting the investigation of the International Criminal Court and also the investigation of the United Nations. The evidence is clear to see, and it goes beyond the scale that any of us ever expected to see in post-Second World War Europe. Liquidations, attacks on residential areas, prohibited weaponry, torture, rape, looting, and many others. The reason why those investigations are important is because they cannot become something which is subject to negotiations, whether that be between Ukraine and Russia. They are matters of international law and principle, and they are fundamental to the future stability of international law and relations. So any divergence from this undermines the credibility and status of international law. Those who commit war crimes, whoever they are, whatever their status, have to be held to account, no matter how long and no matter what happens in the near future. It is also important because, as you talk of reconstruction, the issue of reparations is fundamental. Russia has to be held to account for its activities. So far, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets have been frozen, have been seized, or in other way have been put beyond the reach of their current owners. The reason that is important is because reparations have to come from somewhere. And I talk about reparations in terms of the reconstruction of Ukraine, and also in terms of the compensation and support that those who have lost people, those who have been injured, and all those consequences, which should also be part of that. So reparations are an issue that must not be allowed to drop, and they are a matter that the various international countries of the world can take measures to actually start applying those funds. Some of them may involve issues of law. Something being done collectively, internationally, may be important as well. But there is no reason why those assets cannot start being used now in terms of not only supporting the financial position of Ukraine, but also in terms of reconstruction. And it seems to me this is an issue that must raise up the international agenda and be seen as part of the vehicle for the actual victory of Ukraine and restoration. The other issue that is fundamental, that is only now beginning to emerge because of the food issue internationally, is the international law of the sea has to be guaranteed. The free passage of ships to Ukrainian ports. This is a matter of international law that has to be protected and has to be defended, irrespective of the war that Russia has waged on Ukraine at this moment in time. If the international freedom to navigate is to be upheld, then the international community has to equally take a position on that, to guarantee it, to step in and to allow that. The other issue, of course, is that anything that happens in terms of any discussion so on must be contingent on Russian troops being withdrawn from Ukraine, and the international sovereignty being guaranteed by international law, and that of the Budapest Agreement has to be re-established and upheld. And I think those are preconditions to any form of sanctions that would have credibility at international level. Sanctions are the main international leverage. And it seems to me are something that have to go well into the future until all those issues, the reparations issue, the war crimes issues, the international sea access are properly addressed. So those are matters for the international courts, but they're matters for the international community, but they are matters that can be starting to be dealt with now. And I think it's very important that that debate and that discussion is pushed to a much higher priority. And the only very final one is, of course, one fundamental outcome of this has to be, and that is Ukraine's admission to the European Union. Dziękuję.
Thank you, Mick. We're going to take all the online speakers first, and then take the speakers in the room. So our last online speaker is Bohdan Ferenc from the Social Democratic Platform in Ukraine. So over to you, Bohdan.
Yeah, good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear comrades. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It is a big pleasure to be with you, especially with my colleagues from the trade unions of Ukraine, and with Vasily, with Mr. Volynets, and also Mr. Sobel. Thanks a lot for because it's my first time. I just prepared a short speech, maybe some remarks that could be useful from the side of my organization, because Social Democratic Platform is a non-governmental organization. And by the way, we are happy to cooperate with the UK Labour Party through Westminster Foundation. And my title of my just brief was, and still is, why does Ukraine deserve more? You know, every day, just I, as my friends and thousands of Ukrainians, we begin our day from the notifications from Facebook. Some of my friends usually mention about a new losses with our soldiers. Some of our friends are now at the front line, and they just defend Ukraine from this brutal Russian invasion. These are young male students, for example. These are older male fathers, female volunteers, and these people made completely different plans for life 4 months ago, in which there was definitely no place for war and death. But we are now living in new reality. And the price of freedom and the desire to become a full part of the European community is too high. I think you just can agree with me. It is measured by tens of thousands of dead civilians, including more than 300 children killed by Russian troops, destroyed cities, and of course infrastructure. For 2 months and 27 days in a row, our Ukrainian army and of course Ukrainian people have been resisting new and new attacks by the Russian occupiers in various directions. And as it was previously mentioned, the Russian troops are using methods that violate the rules of war. They attack civilian infrastructure, killing and injuring civilians, including children and women. The Kremlin, as you know, brutally attacked Ukraine with explicitly imperialist aims, I think, with a view to restore what it considers is its so-called rightful sphere of influence in post-Soviet space. And of course, this threatens not only Ukraine and European security order. I think global security system that was, how to say, function in some way now just destroyed. And the aggression also entails a systematic element. Putin's Russia is promoting an autocratic state model using Russism as an ideological superstructural of military expansionism and national cult. I don't know, is it usually discussed in the UK Parliament, for example, or at some conferences through the think tanks, this new so-called Russism as an ideology, you know, because I think it could be, we should pay more attention to this because it's really a big threat in the context of propaganda, first of all. The second point is that the prerequisites for the end of the war are not yet observed. And we should be prepared, I think, for protracted confrontation and support for Ukraine in its struggle. This support primarily provides for the provisions of weapons, financial and humanitarian assistance. And the position of the progressive left in this regard should be, I think, very clear. Maximum support for the Ukrainian people, since Russian bombs and troops cannot be stopped only with the help of pacifism. Because we had this kind of discussions, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago with the leftist colleagues from the UK, and I was happy that a lot of my colleagues just changed their attitude towards the situation and towards Russia and towards this, how to say, this approach only with the pacifism, because as I mentioned, only with this we are not able to stop Russian invaders and occupiers, unfortunately. Diplomacy failed. This must be stated as a fact, but any war sooner or later ends with the truth. Diplomatic efforts alone are not enough for achieving this goal. I think Putin understands only the language of force, not only the future of Ukraine, but also the new system of European and perhaps global security will depend on the success of the Ukrainian army at the front. The second remark is concerning the reconstruction of Ukraine. I think that reconstruction must already begin because there is no need to wait for the end of the war to renew the infrastructure and rebuild the bombed out cities. Unfortunately, tens of thousands of people need a roof over their heads, and children in many villages and cities that were under temporary occupation dream of starting the new school year in renovated schools. A few days ago, I visited with my colleagues one school, not in far away from Kiev, and this school was totally destroyed by Russian bomb. And now the community just doesn't know with what kind of support they can just rebuild this school. And unfortunately, it is a big influence and impact on the education process, not only in this village, but in different regions of Ukraine. All these tasks, of course, cannot be carried out without the help of Western partners, and including the UK in the short and long term. Rebuilding post-war Ukraine will require a lot of financial and human resources. And we need, I think, to be realistic and understand that not only all Western partners will be ready to provide such resources. Domestic problems, the repercussions of the pandemic, the recession, and some fatigue of this war between Russia and Ukraine can influence or can prevent such assistance from being provided. Russian war against Ukraine, I think, influenced a lot on internal questions and in the context of solving internal problems, not only in the closest neighbors of Ukraine, but also I think in UK too, we have this kind of discussion in the context especially of energy and other dimensions. It is also necessary to take more radical steps that will allow Ukraine to overcome the financial and economic crisis. Such a step could be the cancellation of sovereign debt, for example, or at least part of this debt, since the financial system was not particularly capable of covering external debts on loans in the pre-war period. And what can we say when there is a war now? I know that it is quite radical steps, but why we shouldn't discuss this as an option? The provided monetary assistance should have a targeted application and a transparent monitoring distribution system. First of all, the results of the use of this assistance should be seen by ordinary people in construction of residential buildings, bridges, the repair of social infrastructure, the provision of basic needs and social guarantees. I think that new jobs must be created so that people who are already unemployed today can feed themselves and their families. Another serious problem is a decrease in the level of financial transfer from labor migrants. I don't know, but now, as maybe you know or not, the situation is quite critical because many men went to the front or cannot leave the country to work. And traditionally, Ukraine received a lot of external monetary transfers, and it helped to just to support economy. We expect that maybe in the context of the bilateral cooperation between the UK government and Ukrainian government, some programs for sectoral cooperation could be implemented too, with the support, of course, of the members of the parliament. And last but not least, it is impossible to resolve all this problem without a deep restructure of Ukraine itself, I want to say in this kind of expression. The political elites should get rid of the politicians of the past, I think, and oligarchs as much as possible. And the Ukrainian society, which has gone through such difficult trials, should be more demanding of itself and elected to defend their interests. There should be parties in the parliament that will not only strengthen the defense sector and build up military power, but also prioritize education and the social sphere, protect labor rights and fight against the infringement of marginalized groups. In times of war, the most vulnerable always suffer, as we know. And the main task of the progressive left is not to live by the slogans of the past, but to try to act now, in spite of any difficulties. I think trade unions should also be, how to say, modernized and updated in Ukraine. And I am happy that we usually have this kind of discussions because new approaches can fill trade union movements with new vitality in order to better protect workers' rights. And we are sincerely grateful to the British people, of course, for their help and solidarity. I received a lot of messages from my friends from the UK with just proposal to help. And it would also be very helpful if the representatives of the Labour Party were more involved in support of Ukraine. Such support may include very practical actions, such as, for example, visit to Ukraine, because maybe you know or not, here in Ukraine, Boris Johnson is one of the famous politician now. And at the same time, yes, it's true. We can be open today. But at the same time, we really need a voice and visibility of our labor friends and colleagues more. That's why if you will decide maybe to organize such a visit with a UK Labour Party delegation, we will be happy to support and to help with the organizational stuff. Also, such support may include, for example, the initiative for legislation acts aiming at helping the Ukrainian people. Increased sanctions against Russia, by the way, including Russian oligarchs, politicians, and their families who own expensive real estate and assets in London, by the way. And maybe investigations of the links of the Russian financial and industrial groups with some parts of the British political establishment. I know that you have this kind of discussion too. On the part of SD platform, as I mentioned, we will be happy to help or to deepen our cooperation in this regard. Thanks a lot for this invitation.
Thank you, Bohdan. We have discussed a delegation. That's something that we'll continue to discuss. And Chris Ford, Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, who's helped organise meetings here. And that's a live discussion we'll have. So hopefully we'll see you soon and meet in person, some of us. So now we've had all of our online speakers. I particularly want to thank the 3 speakers from Ukraine and also Mick. We're going to come to our speakers in the room. So first of all, we've got Yulia Yurchenko. So over to you, Yulia.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you, our esteemed colleagues. Доброго дня і дякую, що долучилися. Це так прекрасно налагоджувати ці зв'язки і підтримувати співпрацю. I'm going to continue in English just to save time so we have more time for discussion. I wear a number of different hats in this meeting. So in Britain, I'm a Ukrainian British person, been in Britain now almost 18 years. And I'm a political economist who works on the problems of Ukraine, all sorts of different ones, some of which are summed up in my book on Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, where I talk about some of the complex problems that have made armed conflict possible in Ukraine, especially the class struggle in the post-91 history of Ukraine. In the UK, I'm also a member of Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, very good comrades with Chris. Some of people on this call I've met in Kiev when I was part of the delegation this February and before. I'm also a lecturer in political economy, senior lecturer actually at the University of Greenwich, but specifically today I will speak in my capacity as a member of Socialny Ruch, social movement, political organization of Ukraine, democratic socialists, who also, like Pan Ferenc, are trying to fight for a better Ukraine, for the better future. So I will be speaking as a Ukrainian addressing Britain in terms, as a political economist as well, in terms of what can be done in terms of seriously helping Ukraine come out of this conflict, because we are thinking about immediate problems, including the assault on labor rights, but we also need to be thinking beyond this war and what's going to happen with the economy, what's going to happen with different economic sectors, what's going to, how Ukraine can be rebuilt, and how justice can be served in the country. So on April the 10th already, the World Bank report updated its GDP prognosis for Ukraine to say that Russian invasion would shrink its economy by 45% in 2020 alone. That was at the beginning of April. By now, we understand that it will be much worse. The effect on the economy of Ukraine will be much worse. That is simply the shrinkage of GDP, not talking about the exceeding humanitarian and military costs that keep mounting on Ukraine. Ukraine by now has exhausted all rapid financing instruments with international financial institutions, has issued a lot of war bonds, and is beefing up its budget through delving into debt. There's been some financial support coming from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. There's been a big aid package approved in the US Senate, in the US government recently, but that simply, again, will not be enough to cover all these mounting problems that Ukraine is facing, because even before the war has started, Ukraine already was one of the most indebted countries in the world and one of the poorest countries, if not the poorest country in geographic Europe. Not least because after the first war started in 2014, Ukraine's currency collapsed. It 3 times down, amongst a number of other different problems. As part of stabilizing the economy advised by IMF, the currency had to be floated, but we can get into that later. So there are mounting problems, and they have been, and Mr. Ferenc already appealed to the problem of Ukraine's debt. No country in a state of war, especially when it's in some meanings a regional or a global even war, should be burdened with servicing its debts instead of supporting humanitarian, military, and economic needs of its population. That is simply immoral, and also it is uneconomical. If debt givers to Ukraine are interested in Ukraine ever repaying those debts, they should help Ukraine rebuild its economy, not cripple it even further. So I'm part of the campaign with the Debt Jubilee campaign and with the International Committee on Illegitimate Debt and a number of other groups, and we're building a coalition with the social movement, with different left groups across Europe, and the Polish Razem are our big allies in lobbying different governments and members of parliament to help Ukraine get rid of its debt, because it is absolutely atrocious that it has to be paying that. Instead, what Ukraine needs right now, and we've heard even now, we have the opening of the Davos summit, we've heard talks of the so-called second Marshall Plan, and it's not the first time that that plan is being mentioned. We are studying, I'm studying what made the Marshall Plan work and what the problems with it were, because there were a lot of issues with it that shouldn't be adopted wholesale. But there must be an international plan for a macroeconomic restructuring and financing of that restructuring that should be developed internationally. I think British government is indeed, we can talk about Boris Johnson on a different day, but Britain has been an excellent ally to Ukraine in this war. And I think it could be excellent if Britain also could lead and help lead in that kind of international effort to help rebuild Ukraine. Because we talk a lot about rights of people to asylum when they are fleeing wars, but we also need to be talking about rights of people to return to their homes and have those homes rebuilt and build their lives on the terms of their own. So the post-Second World War social and economic reconstruction experience actually does give us some clues as to what that development might look like, what that macroeconomic restructuring might look like. And the last 2 years of pandemic management and mismanagement also taught us a lot on what works and what doesn't work in situations of serious external shocks to economic systems. So we have good and useful blueprints for action that works in conditions of these extreme shocks. State-led development, cross-sectoral support and cooperation, and what's called fiscal activism, which is when the state functions as an investor into its society, when budgetary restrictions as to how much the state is allowed to spend on its public services, on development of its industries, that should be temporarily removed, at the very least temporarily. I've been reading today in the Financial Times that the Germany finance minister is talking about reintroducing austerity across Europe, because it's about time, and in the pandemic we have been spending too much and borrowing too much, and now the war is costing a lot of money, so let's introduce austerity again. We shouldn't allow that to happen. That is very dangerous talk, and that is also producing indirect pressure on other leaders of European states to not support Ukraine and to withdraw their support from Ukrainian government. And we should be building strong international coalition to nip in the bud that kind of talk. This is not the time to be economizing money. We are still not out of the pandemic. The war is putting pressures on all sorts of different sectors that we already heard about today. And that kind of talk should simply not be allowed to be had around. Ukraine is in a state of an unprovoked war, and it is an uneven war, and it needs large-scale, multifaceted international assistance, military and financial, and indeed Britain and US have been leading that effort, and it's fantastic that they have been. So we in Socialny Ruch and in Solidarity campaign and Ukrainian people, and we've heard from the trade unionists and politicians here as well, we welcome that support. We also recognize that that assistance must be used purposefully, and we know that there is problem with mismanagement of funds in Ukraine, not only, but in Ukraine as well. We know that there are some unscrupulous oligarchs and bureaucrats, and I think that serious oversight, multi-stakeholder oversight and management of whatever funds issued to Ukraine is important, and that includes meaningful, what is known in the EU, social dialogue of stakeholders, so trade unions, different independent observer institutions, so that whatever money is being given to Ukraine, whatever money Ukrainians themselves are borrowing and investing, that actually goes purposefully where it should go. I think that is extremely important. And cracking down on oligarchs and their skimming incomes and sending them to offshores, including London, that also needs to be clamped down upon. So in that sense, I think, also what needs to be happening is the cancellation of the Ukrainian foreign debt, and assistance to a country in a state of war should be targeted and at its urgent needs, and shouldn't be used to prop up debt servicing, especially as some debts have been accrued under very odious circumstances. There is this case in the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom about the debt that was issued as a bribe to Yanukovych between Russia, and we're waiting on the kind of decision on that. So last couple of things that we need to, just a list. So what we're asking from the UK government to do, help Ukraine lobby for suspension of debt servicing via a coordinated effort of international institutions and statespersons, similar to the Act 7081 that's just passed the Senate in the United States. Next, help build in this international effort towards cancellation of debt altogether. Ukraine shouldn't be paying its debt, so that international assistance doesn't go to a private investor's interest, whatever, but actually goes towards rebuild the country. Support Ukrainian development of post-war reconstruction plan, collectively financed by reparations from Russia, as well as those international partners willing to support Ukraine based on this kind of model of post-COVID and post-Second World War development and developmental state as a model to lead in the societies. Foremost and first, investing in key industries such as railways, for example, various public services, building the welfare state in Ukraine, building the foundational economy, investing in education and infrastructure, so that there is the safety net in the country, there are jobs. And all of that should be done on the principles of green just transition, social dialogue, and energy democracy. Build energy sovereignty in Ukraine from Russia by investing in care economy, green energy, and supporting transition of industries on just principles. And of course, support military aid for Ukraine, sanctions against Russia, and forfeiture of oligarchic assets towards reconstruction of Ukraine. And I mean all predatory oligarchs, not just Russian predatory oligarchs. There is an early day motion 62 registered by the Debt Jubilee campaign in this parliament. On the 17th of May, I invite all MPs to support it. That is the initial thing to suspend all servicing of debt of Ukraine, and more of that should be done. And one last thing I'm going to say, it's from the war prisoners from the 2014 war already, especially I was been communicating with the wife of Mr. Shevandin, who's been 6 years missing. He's been kidnapped and missing. He's been helping get people out of DNR and LNR, so-called. The issue of political prisoners who are without, who have been kidnapped and tortured and whose lives have been destroyed by Russia and their stooges, that has to be brought back to the forefront of political discourse. We shouldn't forget that Ukraine can never be free until all of its citizens can return home and can be free, and justice can be served to all of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really comprehensive, Yulia. Our last speaker is Greg Schwartz from University, who I know is going to talk about Reconstruction as well. I think at that point, it's a very strict time. We are going to run out of time. So if we've got time, I'll try and bring one or two people in from the floor, but I'm not sure that we will. So over to you, Greg.
Thanks very much for giving me a chance to speak. I mean, I think one of the problems with being the last speaker is that everybody's already said at least half the things you wanted to say. But therein also lies the beauty of this, because it means that I can actually save everybody time. So, so my name is Gregory Schwartz. I'm actually also Ukrainian. I was born in Ukraine, so we have some Ukrainians here. I'm also from Lviv. But that's not the important part here. The important part is that I'm a member of the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. I'm one of the founding members, just like you, I guess, and Chris. And I will speak in my capacity as a member of this organization, although I'm also I'm an academic. I work at the University of Bristol, and I research work and employment and labor migration in Ukraine, or from Ukraine to Poland. I would like to focus on Reconstruction, and I'd like to focus on Reconstruction through the lens of three key areas of intervention: decent jobs, industrial relations, and social provisioning. These things are the kind of things that would secure favorable conditions, socioeconomic security for workers, democratic institutions for social actors, and safety nets for the vulnerable, for the sustainable attainment of a sovereign and democratic Ukraine, rightfully inside the community of Europe's sovereign and democratic nations. Since 2014, and particularly in the last 5 years before the beginning of this phase of the war, Ukraine has made considerable progress on the road towards democratization, institution building, and accountability. By implementing decentralization policies, central and local authority services have been delivering to citizens in more joined up and timely fashion. And that's a really serious achievement, despite various drawbacks and limitations. While their increase of the services has adhered to local control, transparency, and accountability. Achievements were also made in parliamentary oversight and in the development of democratic governance mechanisms by strengthening the involvement of civil society, such as the media, the NGOs, and various parts of society at large. Yet these achievements have always been limited by the need to shoulder considerable debt burden inherited from the Yanukovych era of cronyism and corruption, in which Russia played a very direct and destabilizing role, and the draining effect of the protracted conflict in Donbass since 2014. This meant that deeper reforms, which would increase the value and scope of public provisioning to accompany decentralization and democratization, were always subordinate to, and therefore have been stunted by, the need to balance budgets that needed to prioritize international financial obligations. Some of the things that Yulia has just talked about. In addition, the development of industrial policy and the creation of workplaces that meet the changing needs and aspirations of society for decent jobs and decent pay, supplemented by social security, was another victim of the internal and external shocks faced by Ukraine since 2014. Providing skills, decent jobs and pay, and an economy that promises self-realization through development, supported by an adequate level and range of social provisioning, are key to ensuring sustainable development of Ukraine. Crucially, it would prevent massive immigration and the vicious cycle of human capital drain and economic deterioration. This could lead to economic and political stability that Ukraine so desperately needs. It would protect Ukraine from the creeping vested interests and factional rivalry, and it would prevent Russia from again trying to regain influence over Ukraine's politics and the economy. So these are very short and summarizing type of aspects. So there are essentially these three things: democratic development, economic development that is not separate from democratic development and social development, and social safety nets and social provisioning that is part of the economic policy and part of democratization. I think so. Developing oversight and developing institutions that can facilitate these three elements are fundamental to any kind of reconstruction. So it is therefore important that the UK commits to helping Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine in terms of the Labour Party and the trade unions who can support the Labour Party, whether in opposition or hopefully in government. UK has to commit to helping Ukraine to develop reconstruction policies that ensure that reconstruction outcomes prioritize the following 3 goals. 1, decent jobs and decent pay that form an integral part of industrial policies aimed at upgrading and future-proofing Ukraine's economic structure for self-sufficient and sustainable development. 2, high-road industrial relations, what we call high-road industrial relations, that ensure workers' rights, deepening democratization for an economic reconstruction that brings about just deserts. And 3, adequate social provisioning that brings safety nets and social citizenship in full as a check against mass emigration, human capital loss, and economic precariousness. And with that, I'm happy to conclude. I think many other speakers have said a lot of these things. I think both our speakers in Ukraine and Yulia have said most of what I said. I just really want to stress the importance of institution building and the protection of their democratic character as part and parcel of any rebuilding efforts, rather than something being subordinate to economic and financial goals, because of what we've seen because of the kind of difficulty we already saw in the 8 years prior to the war, that these goals were sacrificed to servicing debt, to financial obligations, some of which, of course, went to trying to help Ukraine balance its budget. But of course, the draining of the continuing conflict in the East, combined with the exorbitant pressure of the debt, made that these social obligations, democratic institutions within society, were always subordinate. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Greg. We've already passed 2 o'clock, and the way that Parliament works, they generally try and throw you out of the room after the hour. So unfortunately, we won't have time to hear from the floor. But I think we can all agree to an excellent meeting today. And on our side, we've had people in the room, members of Parliament, MPs, officers, president of UK trade unions, leaders of civil society organisations. So we can take away what we've heard from our comrades in Ukraine, from the trade union movement, from the social democratic platform, utilise them here in the UK. We can ask questions in Parliament. We can hold the government to account, although it's not our government, and we can plan on how we'll deepen that link that we've started today, that was actually started in February by the visit that was organised through the UK Solidarity Campaign and other organisations, and work forward. And I think today, is just part of that journey. It's not the end of that journey, and we need to be with you every step of the way, pushing forward the points you're making from Kiev, so we can support you here in London. Slava Ukraina.
Героям слава.
Дякуємо вам за прекрасну